All right, let's get rolling. As I said, it's gonna be a really dense PowerPoint. Hopefully this records. I don't know if it will. Please be quiet if it works. Now, first up, we are on timeline number 4. So right 4 in the top left, absolutism. It'll be the absolutism timeline. All right, for our clusters. First off, for the first half of the year, you're gonna draw a triangle. More so, perhaps, than any other timeline we will do this year. This one will go after that pyramid, which is weird because to destroy the feudal pyramid, what are we going to do? We're going to make essentially a brand new, bigger one, right? For absolute central monarchy. Okay. So our actual clusters in the center, we are finally going to move from old church / what did I put? Noble. Old church and noble rule. To what kind of rule? Instead of the church ruling because of God and the nobles ruling because of tradition, we are going to move on to, good vocab word, secular. We're going to move on to secular rule, okay? And finally, just one other. The best word in AP European history applies more to this chapter than any other chapter. That, of course, is Machiavellian. Machiavellian. All right, now, first up, our first section that we're going to do is military and merchants. You can use the same color, it would probably work fine. Oh, I should probably draw a timeline. Grow up.
I did say not yet.
Can we see that? Nope. Ask her. It's good enough. 1600s. This could be really dense 1500s. Okay. Now, above the timeline here, at the very, very top, right underneath your the box, let's draw just a little one like this. And we're going to label that military advancements. Military advancements. Now, how does the military change in the 1600s to the 1700s? Well, the military during the feudal ages, right, was run by who? Nobles, right, at the local level. And we did have some professional knights, but in reality, the military, a normal soldier in the military, what did they do when they weren't fighting? They were a full-time farmer or blacksmith or something. What kind of military are we going to have now? A professional military is the key concept. Professional military. What defines a professional military? First off, permanent, trained, and instead of equipped, just write weapons. Okay? We have a permanent military that's fully trained and has weapons. Think about our military during the American Revolution. They weren't permanent. But a lot of times they went home for the winter, or went to harvest during harvest time. All this stuff. Like, we need a permanent, well-funded, standing army. But what does this require? In order to have a military like that, you must have what? What did you say?
A draft?
Not necessarily a draft, because people will join the army if Hayden.
Money.
You need money. How do you get money?
Taxes.
Taxes. You must have taxes, and what else do you need to run a giant professional army of 500,000 people?
Good leadership.
You need food. You need, I wouldn't just say leadership, you need a big central state. Right? When it's one person ruling 10 people in their little military unit, it's pretty easy to handle. But you need to have, a general staff and all this other. Think about this. We think, whether you're liberal or conservative, we think it's pretty much a good idea that our government handles the roads in our country, right? Because we need roads to function. But in order to handle the roads, you need administration at the top to organize everything, to plan roads, to plan where they go on, to plan maintenance. Then you need somebody at state levels to plan maintenance, somebody at city levels, all the way down to the actual workers that fix the roads or build the roads. That is a big part of bureaucracy. So central state / bureaucracy. The other one we're going to put right underneath it. Okay? Right underneath it this is the exact same thing we put on the last timeline, but we're going to put it again. Okay? we had merchants, bankers. So merchants and bankers become more popular, gain power and influence. When a worker in the 16 to 1700s, as they start to get more power and influence, the urban workers, what word are we going to use?
Elite.
No. Part of the new elite. If you're a worker, if you're a seamstress, or if you're usually male, right? How do you get power? How do workers get power and influence? It's not a union in the 16 and 1700s. It's a same thing. What? Guild. Guilds. Remember that term? They're essentially medieval unions. They start to gain power again. They gain power. Up power. And you can't read that, deal with it. Right? In here, we call that, as we know, the new elite. Okay? They gain power and influence. And we know who they are. They have the money, but they don't have the power. Guys, step back, unfocus your eyes, and look where we are in the timelines, right? In the 1500s to 1600s, we have exploration. We have the Renaissance, where now not church people are buying art because they have money. Well, who are these not church people? They're the new merchants. Towards the end of this, as these people gain more power and money, what's the best example that they have? The best example that they have a super lot of power in the late 1700s? Oh, patronage would be earlier on. Oh my Lord. In the late 1700s, a whole bunch of people who have a lot of money, but no government power. The French Revolution, right? These people, despite having more money and power than ever, more money than the nobles, still are in the third estate, right? Now apply that to all countries in Europe, and you see that there's a pretty big issue. All right. Some other stuff that I want to put on the timeline just as a background is we have the Protestant Rev, right? Because that's going to play a pretty big role. It's really hard to be an absolute monarch when everybody in your country is more loyal to the Pope than to you. So the Protestant Rev actually helps them in some case. And then in the middle of all this, we have Elizabeth I, who we already talked about, but I want to mention as we go into discussing England. All right. The second one we're going to talk about, switch colors if you want. The second one we're going to talk about is, let's look at 2, Westphalia. Westphalia. First and foremost, before we get to the Peace of Westphalia, I want to reference you to one other treaty. What treaty is right here? 1555. Peace of Augsburg. Guys, why would we care about the Peace of Augsburg on the Absolutism timeline? It does allow 2 different religions. Why do we care about it on the Absolutism timeline, Widener? Because the Holy Roman Empire used to be purely absolutism. As France is gaining power, as England is gaining power, Holy Roman Empire is going to drop off a cliff. We'll get to that. But the Peace of Westphalia was 16. This is the last thing we're putting above the timeline in the center, is the Peace of Westphalia. 1648, Peace of Westphalia. Peace of Westphalia was the end to what? It's the end of the 30 Years' War. We always say it's the last large-scale religious conflict, but the key concepts are the Peace of Westphalia marks the end of the church. Do you know what word they use? What kind of church is it the end of? It's not the end of the Catholic Church, because that continues on still today. It's not the end of the Protestant Church, it's brand new. All right? They say it's the end of the medieval church, which we have to agree with. The medieval church is the one that collects taxes. The one there, the priests rule essentially as mayors. It's the end of their true state control, or at least the biggest shock, the biggest sign of their downfall. It's also the downfall of the Holy Roman Empire. And who do we always attach to the Holy Roman Empire? The Habsburgs. And finally, before the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, countries fought because of religion. I'm generalizing, but countries fought because of religion. From 1648 until 1871 in Nazi Germany, or Prussian Germany, essentially, Otto von Bismarck. Well, let me ask you this. From 1871 to the present day, why do countries fight? Nationalism, right? You fight for your country's pride and power. In the middle, 1648 until then, they fight because of the balance of power. They fight because of the balance of power. When Napoleon gains too much land, balance of power. When Louis XIV tries to take over Spain, balance of power. All right. Next fellow. Let's go to France. All right. So real small up top. Real small up top. Well, here. We're going to do Louis XIV. Louis XIV is middle of the 1600s. The only date you ever really need to know with Louis XIV, I always want you to remember when he dies. That's 1715. It's just a good sign. If you remember he dies in 1715, before that is the era of absolute monarchs. Before that is the era of kind of the growing French influence and control. After that, after the death of Louis XIV, we're getting to the French Revolution, so hopefully it'll spark the Enlightenment, right? There's no Enlightenment under Louis XIV, so it all has to come after. By the way, timeline-wise, this is the densest part of your timeline, okay? So write real small here as we get there. Before that, though, who do we care about before Louis XIV? Dumb question. Give me a dumb answer. Who do we care about before Louis XIV? Louis the XIII 13th. But in reality, he's not the main one we care about. Who do we care about? Who ruled for Louis XIV that we care about? You remember Richelieu? I don't know how to spell it. Richelieu? Richelieu. Right. Why do we care about Louis XIII and Richelieu before Louis XIV? They weren't overly successful. They didn't have a lot of power and influence, but they did try to do a couple things that were really, really important. They tried to centralize. They try to centralize, but frowny face, why can't they? What stops them from getting full and complete power at the very tip of this pyramid? The nobles. You remember? They do little things, right? Like Richelieu builds infrastructure. What does Richelieu build? Roads and bridges and ports. Do you remember Richelieu? You remember the intendants? The local rulers for the king that report directly to the king. Those are really important things that will help or allow Louis XIV to build the ultimate absolute pyramid. Okay, and I will say at the very end of their rule, and when Louis XIV is really on, there's an event called the Frond. F-R-O-N-D-E. Do you remember the Frond? It was a riot. It was a riot that was very much so lower class, but was in some ways orchestrated by the nobles. Louis XIV was young enough to be scared of it, but he was, I think he was a teenager, a young teenager, but he was old enough to realize, oh, this riot is because the nobles are big jerks, right? And I'm going to make it my life to get rid of their power and put power on myself because I'm better for France than the nobles are. Does this make sense? Okay. So let's look at Louis. You're going to write Louis, X-I-V, Louis XIV. Next to him, you're going to put his title, how we remember him, and how you can answer every question about him that you need to. Sun King. So we are going to fill Louis XIV's details right under here, just for your timeline, so you know. We are going to use, I'm going to use about half the space under the timeline. Okay, about half the space on the timeline you have to work with for Louis XIV. Okay, maybe a third. Okay, but anyway. So, under him, what's the most important vocab word for Louis XIV? After Sun King, what does he use to rule? No, that's close though. That's the best tangible example of all this. I'm going to go with divine right. Well, guys, how could we be moving towards secular rule? But the first thing I mentioned about an absolute monarch is divine right. Well, that's religious. Can somebody tell me how it can be secular? The answer is Machiavellian. I'm going to simplify here, but is Louis XIV claiming divine right because he's devoutly religious? Does he truly believe, maybe he does, that God selected? No, he's using it to increase his power. To increase his power in the eyes of the nobles and the regular people at Smart. The toughest thing, or the most impressive thing that he does, is he controls the nobles, or we'll write seduce. He seduces the nobles. Okay, it's the most important, most significant thing that he does. On the next one, I would like you to draw a really tiny triangle with a star at the top. What is that triangle? You remember? The triangle of government. All the government agencies, the army, the economy, the even some religion, but the infrastructure. All of the positions that he creates. That's called bureaucracy. And he expands it. He makes it much, much, much bigger, right? In order to centralize his power. Or I should say, centralize all the power of France in him. Now, in order to build a bureaucracy this big, in order to build the roads, in order to build the ports, in order to build a big professional military that's going to go out and win a whole bunch of wars, he has to do what? He can't tax because the Estates General and the nobles won't let him. But he's still going to... So he deficit spends. But we're actually going to put a smiley face next to deficit spending here. How does he deficit spend? Well, he spends the money on things that pay back. Spends the money on roads and bridges and ports because the country starts making more money and he, without raising tax rates, starts making more money. If you tax a person who makes 50 grand a year, 1%, you make so much money. If you get that person to start making $1 million a year, you can still tax him at 1% and make a whole bunch of money. That's how deficit spending works out for him. But towards the end of his life, he starts to make some mistakes that really screws over France, all right? He fights a whole bunch of wars throughout his year, but wars are fine as long as you win them and you win an economic benefit, right? You win something good. Well, at the end of his life, in actually 1714, you don't need to write the date now, I just want you to point out a date. What happens in Europe? Remember? The Spanish king dies. Do you know the last name of the Spanish king at this time? It's a Habsburg, right? So normally the Habsburgs would put another Habsburg. But what's happened on this timeline? The Habsburgs are still there, but they're super weak. So when they say, oh, we still want to control Spain, all of Europe laughs at them. And France says, you know what, I'm going to put my nephew, I think, on the throne. Well, we're after the Peace of Westphalia. So what's the problem with that? You have the strongest country in the world, France, in Europe. Now they're going to control one of the historically average or above average countries. That would severely upset the balance of power. So who is France fighting in the War of Spanish Succession? The same people Napoleon was fighting. Everybody. Because nobody wants to see the War of Spanish. So he has the Spanish Succession. Right at the end of his life, spends a whole bunch of money on it, gets nothing back. That's a big frowny face. That's bad. He upset the balance of power. You can put that on there. And that's our Louis XIV. Those are just the key concepts. There's one thing I forgot. You don't have space, just write it off to the side somewhere. What's the best physical example, we said it earlier, of his bureaucracy, of centralized power, of divine right, of seducing the nobles? That's Versailles. Versailles. You should have Versailles on there somewhere because it is mentioned in the key concepts. All right, next up. My favorite absolute monarch, who was that? Peter the Great. Peter the Great, of course, is from Russia. Guys, what's a good date to know for Peter the Great? What date do we remember for Louis XIV?
1705.
It's 1715 because he died then, so that's for the end. Just remember, Peter the Great died in 1715 also. Ah, it's a double date. That's easy to remember. He actually dies in 1725, but it doesn't matter. Just remember 1715, right? So you know the years before that are Peter the Great. So Peter the Great has less. We're going to use about half of the remaining space now on Peter the Great. Okay? Peter the Great's about the same time period. So close that we're not going to worry. On Peter the Great, in reality, there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to remember about him. But just like remembering Sun King for Louis XIV, there's only one thing you need to know about Peter the Great. He was the great Westernizer. Westernization, right? What's the best physical example of him westernizing the country? For Louis XIV, it was Versailles, but Russia is so backwards, you can't just build a palace. What do you have to build? A city. St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg serves a couple roles. It's not only a sign of how great his power is, it's also, oh God, caffeine just slipped away. It also is used to seduce the nobles, just like Louis XIV made the nobles travel to Versailles and every year just to kind of debase them and get them out of their castle. Peter the Great made the nobles physically move to St. Petersburg if they want to continue his power, right? What other thing does St. Petersburg do? Yes?
Venice of the North.
It's the Venice of the North in that it is trade. Yes. Trade and shipping. Remember, Peter the Great goes on the grand tour around Europe. His favorite place was the Netherlands because he got to learn how to build ships. Yeah, we do remember this stuff. All right. So Peter the Great does all this stuff. What else does he westernize? We should write the beards. Remember, he got off the boat in back in Russia after his grand tour, and the first thing he did was shave the beards off his off his friends that serve him. Because it shows he's more powerful than religion, which was making them grow beards in the first place. You can also write military, M-I-L. He fights something called the Great Northern War against Sweden, and he gets his butt kicked, so he westernizes his army. They wear new uniforms, they fight with new tactics, and all this other junk. After he dies, Catherine the Great takes over. She continues a lot of what Peter the Great does. But she's not quite as good as Peter the Great is. Don't worry about the rest of the stuff for her. Hopefully there's still a little space down here. If not, we can make it work. That's Peter the Great. Any questions? All right, next one is the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire. When we look at the Holy Roman Empire, I want you to, with that color for the Holy Roman Empire, give like a little underline or box around the piece of Augsburg, right? Because if you're the Holy Roman Empire and you suddenly allow two different religions in your country, that hurts. You're going downhill. I also want you to maybe underline or put a little box around the piece of Westphalia, or you can double star this Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg, because that obviously is a sign that they're going down. I'm going to put the Holy Roman Empire over here. I will tell you, it's the only thing going on the left side, and it's the only thing on this timeline that's not like on the timeline. You know how underneath it's like general terms? Well, these guys definitely happened on the timeline. This is just someplace. Holy Roman Empire, and we're going to do 1700s to the 1800s. Somebody have a question? So what do I want you to write there? Easy. The Holy Roman Empire does start to split up a little bit, but it has a series of rulers that we should know. Now, the two most powerful regions in the Holy Roman Empire are who and who? I'll give you, it's the future countries. It's Prussia and it's Austria. And do you remember the type of rulers that these two countries had? They were rulers who had complete control. We're on the absolutism timeline. But they weren't like super evil. For how old and conservative the Holy Roman Empire was, they actually do some things to improve. Do you know who they were? Do you know what the title of them are? They were called the Enlightened Monarchs. Okay? And I'll explain that more in a second. The Enlightened Monarchs. And there's, I think, 3 of them we're going to list. I did not teach them much, but they show up in the key concepts, they mention them. Miss Rupp, what's one of the Enlightened Monarchs? Frederick. So first up, we have Frederick William. Frederick William I of Prussia. Then we have Frederick II. And for Austria, we only need to know one, and she's a woman. It's Maria Theresa. Now listen. How many of you don't remember what an enlightened monarch is? It's okay. Raise your hand. It's fine. Just Hayden. Just Hayden. Bridget knows what it is. Bridget, explain to me an enlightened... Yeah, that's what I thought. All right. Let me ask you this. What do you think an enlightened monarch did? I don't know. It's halfway through the test. I'm exhausted. I can't think anymore. Okay. Let's act like an unenlightened monarch. Let's like an old, conservative, miserable monarch. Think about the things they would do when ruling their people. Okay? Now picture the opposite. What do you think an enlightened monarch would do? Yes?
They do the Enlightenment ideals.
Such as?
Education.
Education is big, right? They start to promote education. We're not full public education, but we are what kind of education? Secular, right? Let's not necessarily have priests running all the schools. What else do you think an enlightened monarch does? I'm not writing these down because I know we're pressed for time. If you want to, go ahead. But again, just think. What else would they do? They would build infrastructure. They would centralize the military under their control. Instead of having nobles control, they would centralize it. Guys, 1700s and 1800s. What's going on in the 1700s? Literally, the Enlightenment. What would be the #1 anti-Enlightenment thing a leader could do? What's the most anti-enlightened thing? Seal?
Censorship.
Exactly. So these enlightened monarchs actually don't love censorship. They'll censor some things. But Catherine the Great, who sometimes is thrown in with enlightened monarchs, she actually is a pen pal with Voltaire. So she writes him letters, he writes her letters. Like, that's a big deal. These are enlightened monarchs, okay? So, which, by the way, is wonderful for society, but it's really bad if you're the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, right? Because it's ended. Next up. Just about the last set of guys is number 6, and that is England. And it is going to go essentially at the bottom of this, okay? But I am going to erase so that I have room to write. So we are going right under Louis the 14th and Peter the Great. And we are going to look at England. Now, guys, what is special about England? Why are you shocked? Why are you confused? This is the absolutist. Hey, it's colored pens. Shut up. I don't care. God, Mimi. I hope 5 years from now my Euro kids are watching this recording. They just think back on you and they go, ugh, Mimi.
5 years from now, they're not going to know who she is.
Thanks, Killjoy Rachel. Great as always. All right, let's finish this up. God, what are we doing?
England. Why is England?
Oh, we're in an absolute timeline, right? England's not absolutism. They are, in fact, the opposite of absolutism. What is the opposite of absolutism? Yes? Constitutionalism. Constitutionalism, where you have actual rules that govern. You can still have a monarchy, but have actual rules is the opposite of absolutism. So, in England, first off, guys, why are we going to end up in chaos in England in the early to mid to late 1600s? Why the early 1600s? Why is England crazy? I don't know, Mr. Bridges. Well, think about what happened at the end of the 1500s. Elizabeth the First is in charge. Elizabeth the First good or bad for England? Great for England. What's the problem? The Virgin Queen dies without a male heir, so we got to go find a group. Who do we find? The Stuarts. Okay? The Stuarts are from Scotland, and they're Catholic. And they take over recently, quote-unquote, Protestant England. All right? They good guys or bad guys? Bad guys. They're super aggressive. They want full power, all this other junk, which means that we end up in the mid-1600s with what? It's the English Civil War. Okay? It's the English Civil War. What do we actually need to know about this? Well, let's know the Stuarts. You don't need to know all their names, but there's only two, right? James, Charles. I forget. I think it's James the First, Charles the First, Charles the First, Charles the Second, James the Second. Doesn't matter. Just guess. You get a 1 in 4 shot. Okay. If you see James the First or Charles the Second, just know it's English Civil War-ish time, and that the Stuarts are in general big ugly jerks. So they get in a fight for a while. It's the king's army versus the parliament's army. It's the king trying to assert his authority. It's parliament trying to say, no, we signed the Magna Carta in 1215 that limited your power, and you're not taking it just because all the other kings are. Who wins? Parliament. And that means we end up with Cromwell. Cromwell in charge. Is Cromwell Catholic? No. He's Protestant. Not only Protestant, but he's super Protestant. He's, what is he? Puritan, right? So super strict, blah, blah, blah. Runs it as like a military dictatorship. They never really get back to full democracy control. Those other junk. When he dies, people kind of realize, all right, that was crazy. We're England. We need stability. So they invite the Stuarts back, which is great. But the Stuarts, when they come back, are still jerks. All right? By the time we get to the second Stuart, though, he realizes they're too big a jerks to stay in control. Parliament realized they can't let this king in control. And they have two options. A, they can fight a second English Civil War, or we can have, in 1688, the Glorious Revolution. Why is it a Glorious Revolution? Because it was a revolution, right, without any bloodshed. Without any bloodshed. The Stuart, I think it was James II, just packs up and leave. And it proves for all time in England that Parliament is greater than the king. A rule that is still done today. Now, what other key concepts are in here? Well, since people were so afraid that the king was going to take absolute control and they would lose all the power they once had, England immediately writes up what? Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights. And finally, they end up with, we can't not have a king. We're England. We must be stable. So they call up William and Mary, our favorite cousins. William and Mary Orange from the Netherlands. Okay? And my very last two things, just about, is who's writing during the English Civil War? John Locke, right? He's writing during the chaos and craziness of the English Civil War. What kind of government did he call for in his book Leviathan? Oh my God. Hey, at least you noticed. All right. Hey. What was I going to do? I totally forgot. Oh, Hobbes. He's writing during the chaos of the Civil War. He writes a book called Leviathan. What kind of government do you think he wants? If you grow up in anarchy and chaos and civil war, what kind of government do you yearn for? What? A stable. And what's the most stable form of government? A monarch, an absolute monarch, where nobody can question their authority. You may not like it for personal freedom, but when you're in, you just want an absolute monarch who can make the decisions and go with it. So he writes a book called Leviathan about that. That's great. Who's writing during the Glorious Revolution? Locke. He writes a book called Two Treatises of Government. He says that, no, we shouldn't have absolute monarchs. We should have what? Democracy. And that people are born with Tabula rasa is a blank slate. Hobbes thought people were naturally greedy. Hobbes thought that life was nasty, brutish, and oh my God, it's like I taught you something. Locke said, no, people are blank slates when they're born. They can be raised halfway decent. All this other junk depends on their surroundings. I believe in democracy, and he believes that people are born with what every human being has, natural rights. Okay? Guys, your DBQ was about the Enlightenment. It had Enlightenment stuff in there, but it was heavily on the Glorious Revolution. First off, look at this timeline, which is the middle of 14 timelines that we're going to do. It doesn't span the whole country. And the entire DBQ was about this, which I know is intimidating because it's not a lot. But guys, what were the documents? Okay, was there a document from a guy in Parliament? Was there a document from the King? Was there a document from the English Bill of Rights? Was there something by or about William and Mary of Orange? I think John Locke was on there too, wasn't he? And then there was some Enlightenment stuff, right? Who was the Enlightenment documents? Voltaire? Maybe somebody else. Like, they're not trying to trick you. I know it's under a very small amount, but it's right there, okay? Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, arguments, compliments?
Good job.
Thank you. All right, let's hope that actually recorded.